Hi, my name is Dan Feir, and I am a ThoughtWorker, software engineer consultant at ThoughtWorks. If you're not familiar, it's a global consultancy, and we work with a lot of cool people. And I'm actually really excited to follow up the React Native talk because the ideas that are kind of embedded in this talk are inspired by React Native and my experience actually at ThoughtWorks working on a React Native project when we were around .22. And Enzyme wasn't really supporting React Native. And we also discovered that testing was a little bit trickier because the tooling really wasn't there for us. So it really got us to think about testing. And so yeah, here we are, like a year and a half later. And I've been having this conversation a lot with different coworkers pairing on writing different React applications. And the first question that I asked them is, what is the value of a test? And I think oftentimes I don't get the answer that I'm really looking for. I think some people write tests and they want their tests just to make it green. And sometimes those tests will fail if the application is breaking, but they don't. They write a JUnit test for those who kind of have worked in both Java and wrote JUnit tests, and then come to JavaScript and you see this object instantiation and it just kind of checks some values. And so I wanted to first kind of give my answer to that question, like two different values that I get out of testing, which is living documentation for our code. So, I've done a couple of retail projects and we have built mini carts. And all of you are looking at that component and saying, I know what that does. But I guarantee that you didn't think that the business logic followed some of those things. My favorite was the should close minicart of about after some time scale. So this is modeled after an example that I worked with. And that's not something you're going to initially know when you're working with that component. But and you could maybe decipher it by finding that set timeout or whatever you're using to close the actual minicart. But this test is a great way to kind of document the business rules that we need for that minicart as we move through time. Because I'm not going to be working on the minicart the whole time. The other reason is confidence as we change our code and scale. And so I really like this imagery associated with it. So if we have any rock climbers, or more specifically lead climbers, I know it's like a popular sport in the software space. I like it as an example because as you're kind of climbing up this wall, you're doing just a little bit of extra effort to put something in such that when you fall, you only make a short fall instead of falling all the way to the ground. And to equate this back to software, you don't want your whole application to crash, especially in retail, because you might lose a bunch of money or break your leg, I don't know. And so I think two ways, a litmus test that I use to say, hey, are we writing really good tests? Do we have really good test coverage? Is to be able to answer these two questions. Can you immediately hand over your work in progress right now? If so, then maybe your test coverage is there. And then can you confidently make a change and push it straight to production? And if you have hesitations around either of these things, tests can definitely elevate your confidence. It's not the only thing, but I think testing can be a huge part of these two questions. So really I want to talk, this talk is really about the power I think that comes from these new, or not new, but these tools, JSDom and Enzyme. And as they've kind of developed and come into their own right, I think, man, they have become very powerful tools for me, and I want to review them really quickly for those who might not be familiar in the audience. I mean, at this meetup, I assume you guys are vaguely familiar with these terms. I'm not going to try to write a description of JSDom. I'm just going to let JSDom's README tell you, because they write the best descriptions. But I think, JSDom, the things that I really like about it are the ability to avoid race conditions because it's executing in process, and that it's implemented in JavaScript. And I think there's a couple different things that are great about JSDom, but these are the two that are really exciting. Because one, I can debug and figure out what's going on when something goes wrong, because it's JavaScript, I'm familiar with it. And the race conditions really comes into play when we talk about some of these tests that I'm going to go over. So, and Enzyme, for those who are not familiar, again, they kind of say it best. I think with Enzyme, though, the one thing that I would add to this is it allows us to interact with React components similar to the way that the user would interact with them on the page, which I think is a pretty novel idea that comes with Enzyme, and one that was really powerful when trying to test React Native, one that doesn't have a DOM. Right? You just interact with these things. An Enzyme or some utility like Enzyme allows us to kind of interact with it in a way that I think you can argue looks or feels, or you can believe that it is similar. Cool, so let's test an app. Don't make fun of me. I'm not a UI specialist. I kind of threw this together. But this is our login app. I really like the login app because it's something everybody has. Everybody, or a lot of people, have this login interface. So we're going to click login. That's going to show us this form. We're going to fill out this form, press submit. Then we're going to see our account details. And then you can log out if you'd like. And so the last time I gave this talk, people got really hung up on what the components were as we were testing. So I put these little identifiers. One might argue that the login form doesn't need to do two things, and I would agree with you. But for this example, let's just all pretend that there's like just 3 components we're testing. You could definitely break this problem down a little bit more, but I want to use these as reference points. Cool. So this is the first test, and so I wanted to show what I thought was the naive version of this test first, and then kind of walk through it, and then we'll walk through the exact same test, but a little bit differently. So again, you might not do these things, and I might be kind of over-exaggerating, but I do see this quite a lot, and it's kind of frustrating. So people will they'll mount the component, but they'll get the instance because they want to call the onLogin button, whether it's this thing that looks like another event function on the component, or this underscore, how we sometimes would use underscore to make private methods, this thing that doesn't really exist, or at least the way that people have used them. And then expect on the state. So I've seen this test before. You might be like, well, I wouldn't necessarily do that. But I think there's a lot of problems with this test. And so the one thing is, whoops, this is hugely problematic to me. I feel like when people really feel comfortable when they're calling these functions because they know that that is going to get them to this end state where their errors are there. And this is also, I think, familiar. So I work, I think, with a couple of people that come from the Java background in writing unit tests with Java. And I think what's interesting is that the people that I work with that will tend to do this are actually breaking one of those rules that they hold so dear, which is encapsulation. Like you would not want to call the private methods, because these really truly are private methods to the component. At the end of the day, we only really interact with the rendered output of that component. And I think different internals, like the onLogin button or the submit, as well as the state, we don't actually care the structure underneath these components. I think if you're talking about TDD, you can talk about how tests might influence your design, and maybe you can go down that road. But I think over time, this test is going to be a little annoying to maintain, because if I want to change the onLogin button function, or the way in which I store errors in that component, this test will break unnecessarily. And so I want to suggest a very slightly different way to write this test. And so I think some of these ideas might not even be new, but I think there's something profound in the way in which, like the way these tests are written. So mounting the login form, just like we did before, but not getting the instance. Instead of calling the functions, let's interact with the component the same way that a user is going to interact with this. So let's click on the login button, and let's click on the submit button. That's exactly what the user is going to do. And then they're going to see somewhere in the HTML. Again, you could maybe argue that the specificity of that expectation is a little too broad. But we are going to see something in the UI where there's a username required and a password required. And this test is not going to break because you decide to refactor that login form. It's going to break because you don't actually see that error anymore, which is the most important thing. And I think there's semantics associated with this, but I think if we compare the last test and this test, you're going to get more value out of this test. Oops, and let's break down this test. So I kind of already did that. So some characteristics of these tests that I want to call out. So we're testing things that are less likely to change. So make sure, I think we articulated that pretty well. We're testing the interactions and behaviors over the functions. So function calls don't really mean anything in the browser. They're just the thing that facilitates the interaction. The interactions and how the user use these things, whether it is even React Native or a React app, or however you're using React. You can write fewer tests, which is great because again, the scope of those tests I think get a little wide, and that becomes somewhat problematic. But you don't need to test exactly how that login function works or exactly how that submit function works, because at the end of the day, you really just care about the behavior that happens in the render function. arguably. And I think another thing that I've noticed as I've had this conversation with people is that people often associate this with unit testing, and I kind of want to call it unit testing, and I kind of don't, because I think there's a couple mental models that come with that are favorable and some that aren't. And so I've typically tried to rebrand this as behavioral component testing, just so it's just a new idea that I can latch onto and kind of talk through it with people. Because I think the unit under test is not necessarily these like function input outputs, but it's in fact the props and the interactions into a component, and then what is the rendered output at the end of the day for a component. So let's look at another test. So this one is redirecting to that account page on a successful submission. So this one's a little bit more intense, and this is kind of that naive way to write it, or at least I would argue. So we're getting the instance function again. There's a spy that we set up, and some credentials, and then we're going to kind of go through these things, but we're going to actually set it this time. It's going to be valid. We're going to call submit, and then I'll see people assert on the spy being called correctly, and then let's say that the instance or the login form, the way it maintains a redirect on that render is it checks the state of this property called redirect. Again, this function or this test will break in certain cases if you break the app, which is what we want out of tests. I think going back to those first 2 points, like as you scale up, if you have this test there, it's going to break, and that's going to be good because you don't necessarily want to push something to production after this test breaks. However, again, we don't want that unintentional breaking because we're refactoring something like how this imported API function works, or maybe we don't store credentials in that way anymore. Instead, sorry, I wanted to break down these slide by slide. Okay, so instead, I want to say let's write a wrapper, and let's write this thing called fill-in field, which is just kind of leveraging some of the enzyme tooling to actually fill in a field, and very similar to the way in which a user will fill in the field. And then let's create that spy again, but instead let's make it a stub, and let's stub out the function and make it resolve. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't actually matter if that function is called. It matters that when it resolves, that the component's rendered output is what we would expect. If it's called with some credentials, that doesn't mean the component is working the way you would expect. And a quick call out that I think is really, like, again, going back to Enzyme and that this way in which we interact with our React components that is, I think, a little bit more novel. You can write functions like this that are they're very easy to write. And I think they make your tests a little bit more intuitive. So again, when we talk about like living documentation, you can write a very specific it statement, and it can be something that is really descriptive. But if someone can walk through your app and say, oh, fill in that field and fill in that field, I know what that means. And that actually translates across roles. So if you work with QAs that are maybe not as technical, they can leverage these functions that you write for them because these are very familiar to things like Selenium. Cool. So again, we're testing the interactions that the user is going to have with this app, this very simple app, where they click on the login button, they fill out these fields, they find the submit button, they click it, and then instead, so maybe you might notice the redirect from React Router. Pretend that's under the hood, I think I really like the redirect component because redirecting on a page is not necessarily that's something that is easily conceptualized in a render function. And so this is what it is. This is what it equates to, is this rendering of this component. And then at the end of the day, I kind of trust React Router to do the rest because I trust my libraries to do what they say they do, maybe to a fault. So some concerns that you might have with this, because it's not all rainbows. I think TDD is tricky. I think this conversation gets a little hairy, so if you want to talk to me after, we can definitely talk about TDD. Errors are not immediately obvious, so I think the scope of your test, when is it increased? The beauty of a unit test, if we write, I think I love going back to Java examples, you know exactly where that failure happened. And in this case, you might have to reconstruct the plot of the crime scene a little bit. And I think even if you add Redux, I would argue that Redux is going to be in that scope of that unit test. And that it makes it even harder to find those errors immediately. These tests are not intuitive. So calling those functions feels very comfortable to people. Calling on login button, they know that that's going to happen. So they can kind of step through these tests and in their mind see these things happen. And I found that really like educating around what Enzyme is doing and what JSDom is doing gets people to that place where they feel really comfortable simulating something and being like, oh yeah, that's what the browser is going to do. And it's not that far of a leap, but I definitely have to get people there before they're really comfortable writing these tests. Defining the scope is really tough. I think this is probably the biggest concern that I have because I kind of go back and forth. I don't have a good answer to this question of what is the right amount of scope of these tests. But I do think that they are, like all things, you should just use them when they make the most sense. I think you could still be unit testing different functions or different very specific business logic that is important to your application. And you can write those unit tests that are maybe a little bit more flaky, but they're very important, and that's okay. Cool, so what now? I think I love interrogating those like small, the individual tests. I love doing that with people, and I love stepping through it in this presentation. But I think that doesn't really matter if we don't think about the larger picture, which is our test strategy. And so people will model this as a pyramid. And I think that in the pyramid, behavioral component tests maybe fit towards the bottom, very, very close to unit tests. And that's just because of the speed, the feedback loop that they provide, I think is relatively similar. If we talk about costs of tests, these are relatively cheap. They run really, really fast, especially when you have a lot of them. And this is kind of this is the next step of this. So if I can convince you that behavioral component tests are great, and you're writing them within your app, I think this is the next step that I've been working with QAs to do, is to write tests like this that do have a little bit more scope, but that look very similar to Selenium tests. So we're going to test the whole login app. We're going to click it. We're going to fill in some stuff. We're going to submit it, and then we're going to assert that the account details are there as we would expect. And I think these tests are really cool to show to somebody who's been writing Selenium scripts or different automated tooling, because they're like, wow, that looks really familiar. And these tests also run a little bit differently than those tests, and they are maybe a little bit more deterministic, or at least you can make them a little bit more deterministic, rather than doing these kind of weights and hoping that these tests, your functional tests, don't break. And so I've been exploring this. I haven't been able to do this a lot, so I'm excited about this idea of maybe adding another thing called subcutaneous functional tests. So again, I've just used like these names because it's very convenient to like put things in new boxes. Because if you say functional tests, people again have predispositions about what that means. And so we say subcutaneous functional tests because they're not necessarily executing in a browser. They're just under the skin. And so so I think this is something that is got cut off a little bit. This is something that is really exciting to me. Actually, some friends of mine, both at ThoughtWorks and at a company actually in New York called Peloton, are writing two sets of tests. One, their Selenium tests or their functional tests, and then writing their these subcutaneous functional tests right side by side, and then watch when those things break. So if they break at the same times that you would expect, or if one breaks and the other doesn't, like you can do these comparisons and build that trust. Because I think some people are not necessarily comfortable with all of these ideas at once. So that metric is super helpful for convincing people that maybe this is a good idea. And I think those of us who have been developers on projects with a lot of functional tests that are running really, really slow and really, really painful to deal with, this is the most exciting thing. You're like, holy smokes, you're telling me we can get rid of those things? That's kind of I think the second iteration of this conversation is if we can get past all that other stuff, like let's start talking about subcutaneous functional tests. And so I kind of want to leave you with this final thought. Why are you writing that test? Ask yourself that question. It's amazing how many times people don't necessarily have a good answer to it. Thanks.
So it's not so much a question as a comment. It was really cool to see this because we did exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. Every test would have, you load the form, you look for the inputs in it, you change them with a change input function, and then you look up the form element instead of the idea of the submit button, and then you call submit in the form. And then after that, we have a check that the API was called correctly with the right API endpoint and with the right inputs. And when we started, we had a mess of state checks too, but over time we just completely eliminated that and made that a core philosophy of all our tests, that no one should be checking state. That's kind of the wrong idea. You should be looking at how the user inputs it and then how the user ultimately sees it, which in both cases avoids checking the state of the React component. So it was just really cool, and I really appreciated you talking because we found ourselves in the exact same boat, and that's great to hear.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, these are definitely not new ideas. I want to talk more about them, and I think this is exciting to have these conversations. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm just curious, where do you possibly see Jest fitting into your testing picture, or do you?
Yeah, I mean, I use some Jest stuff in there. Jest has been super convenient. I don't know. I like to Jest is great. It's kind of, I think, my default right now. I think but you can totally get away with using this in Mocha. These things are not beholden to something like Jest. I think it is really Enzyme and JSDom that are driving these things. I think when you start talking about matchers and assertions, that's when maybe Jest is starting to win because they're getting more good stuff. You know, and I don't know if I even have that formula yet, and I'm trying to build that because this is kind of still new to me. I've been trying to give this talk and just have these conversations because I'm not exactly sure what that perfect combo is, and I want to find it because I want to be able to I want to be able to write these tests really easy.
Where do you see snapshot tests coming into play?
Oh, that's super interesting. Yeah, so I think snapshot tests. I haven't actually used snapshot tests yet, and I hope to use them. But I think snapshot tests conceptually to me make me a little nervous because the phrase that I like to tell people when I say you're just instantiating an object, calling some functions, and inserting any output. You're just testing that the code is the code, and snapshot tests feel like they're just testing the code as the code. However, I think snapshot tests, from what I understand, have a really good place in subcutaneous functional tests, because if you're testing substructures of the app and you want to assert that it's not changing other substructures, snapshot tests I think are going to make that a little bit easier, rather than mounting the entire app and doing some weird assertions. Thank you very much.